What's up, everybody? Peter Exo Coffee here. Welcome to another episode of the Level Up, the personal branding podcast. So today we're doing Elvis, the music, the movie, and branding. And so when I watch, um, biopics, so to speak, I look at what are they trying to do. What notes are they hitting when it comes to the branding? I thought it was very interesting because, when I did a duel with Elvis paired up with Johnny Cash. And as I thought, I mentioned in this episode, I think, for that era, Elvis sits atop right now, but, you know, Little Richard and Chuck Berry ain't catching Elvis, but Johnny Cash might. And the branding of this is a lot, there's a lot, Johnny Cash looms, his brand looms in this film a lot. And I'm going to point some of that out. The first interesting thing that they do is, they make Colonel Tom Parker the narrator. And that's very interesting because, I would say Colonel Tom Parker an unreliable narrator. Yes, and that's very an apt term because they deal with you know I mean he kind of took Elvis for a ride a lot when it comes to money and decision making and everything else, at least early on. But a lot of the attempts to reshape Elvis's brand comes through the voice of Colonel Tom Parker as this unreliable narrator. So it's interesting, as I'm putting on my fiction writing hat now and all the fiction writing workshops I've sat in over the years at Gen Con and smaller cons. And so very interesting because, they are trying to reorient and sort of massage Elvis's brand here, but they're protecting themselves, through this use of Colonel Tom Parker as the unreliable narrator. And a lot of it now has to do with Elvis and race, and I spoke to this a lot when I did the Johnny Cash Elvis duels, and there's always been folks coming at oh, so I got my first call during a recording, so we'll see how that um, shows up in the recording. But I was saying that a lot of the revisions when it comes to Elvis, this movie has to do with race. Um, because again, and I was saying before the phone call that, folks take shots at Elvis and, you know, and I dealt with this a lot in the duels with Johnny Cash. I don't think Elvis was a racist, but the record industry back in the late 50s and early 60s was extremely racist. So, yeah, Big Mama Thornton did not get paid for a very long time, if at all, for Elvis's version of Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog. But that is not, and then Colonel Tom Parker, I'm sure, did a lot of shady stuff. But, um, and again, in the movie shows it, and I think this is genuine. Elvis grew up, again, I'll use this term I used in the duels. If he, back in Mississippi and Tennessee, you had the black side of town and the white side of town, and oftentimes they were on, the railroad track separated the two sides of town. And if Elvis didn't live if he didn't live in the black community growing up, he was right there at the railroad tracks, in the white community. So, I don't, what degrees of racism do people even have today? So I don't, Elvis certainly was not a flaming racist. So people take issue. One of the controversies is BB King. Elvis, grows up in Mississippi, but he comes up through Sun Records in Memphis, and that's where BB King came up. And they had a friendship, and BB King talks about their friendship in his own biography, uh, and he flatly said, Elvis ain't, was not a racist, and he even defends, some of the charges of ain't nothing but a hound dog and whatever and all that other stuff. And he said, hey, everybody borrows from everybody, and black folks say, man, look, I just did an episode on, my three things for, July. I talk about how much, Travis Scott and other current hip hop artists have borrowed some of the live tricks from punk music. So yeah, I mean it's not it's two ways how the borrowing of things. So so that's the first thing. I mean um and Elvis and BB were friends, and they did talk about the music industry and gave each other tips. And BB talks about that in his biography. The other thing, when they show Elvis in the black church in this movie, um, they show him sneaking into the blues clubs and as a young white kid. So they are trying, they go out of their way to make, this connection. And again, I think Elvis, when you measure him against, other white peers in the South at the time, I think he's certainly more progressive than the rest of them. Now, how we would measure up today, I mean, 70 years later, I mean, come on. But, so that's the one thing. And then, they do a lot of, very creative. They have Elvis taping the special, his comeback special in 1968. And in the middle of the taping, that's when, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. That did not happen. But I honestly believe that Elvis, was saddened and was shocked by Dr. King's death. Remember, it happened in Memphis, and Elvis was born and raised in Mississippi, but career-wise, Memphis was his career home, and that's where he made his, you know, that's where Elvis, the legend was born, and that's where Graceland's at. And so, it's interesting how they use Memphis in this, in this movie, BB King and Dr. King, and this nexus, this locus that they try to build, for with um, Elvis and race. So it's interesting how they do all this, and then how this feeds into Elvis's brand. The other thing is how they deal with Elvis going to the army, because it's almost like, look, the white preachers in the South were not happy with Elvis, but they almost make it sound like they were ready to put a bullet in Elvis because he was going to corrupt all the white youth, and he was this, this white, young white man doing black music, and an end lover, and he was, going to corrupt the youth. And, there were undertones of all that. And then, through our unreliable narrator, Mr. Colonel Tom Parker, there was a meeting, an ultimatum was given, send Elvis away to the army or else. Now that didn't happen. I mean, Elvis was drafted. He did not volunteer. He was drafted. He probably could have gotten out of that, but Colonel Tom, and Elvis both felt it would be wise to do, the 2 year stint in the army would soften his image and, that rebel image that he had. Now, Elvis was a rebel for the time. Was he a rebel at heart? No. Um, So that's more or less why that happened. But again, race is tied into that as well. Um, Interesting how they present Elvis's relationship with his mother, because at points in the movie, his mother can be pretty confrontational with Elvis, and that was not. You look at Elvis. The folks who've researched Elvis. He was a mama's boy, and his mother doted on him. So Elvis was not. You know, Elvis's mom didn't have to, yell at him or rant to get him to do stuff. I mean, Elvis was, mom was, you know, what mom wanted, Elvis and mom always found a way to meet in the middle and figure things out. The movie also delves into Elvis's reaction and how he felt was devastated when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated as well. So it's interesting because I mean, you know, um, millennials and Gen Z are a lot more progressive than older generations. So again, the movie's pivoting into there, and what that kind of motivated me to do was to do some digging into the relationship between Elvis and President Richard Nixon, because I think the most published picture of all time of Elvis was with Richard Nixon, and so he made the trip to the White House, and you know President Nixon made Elvis a honorary government agent, and not didn't say FBI or DEA, but when it comes to the war on drugs. And so that was interesting. To my knowledge, though, that was the only time Elvis and Richard Nixon ever met, which was interesting. I thought they had a much deeper relationship than that, but they did not. And that was essentially a press op that Colonel Tom Parker put together. But yeah, so it's interesting, where this fits. Across the Universe 2007, Hollywood trying to reimagine the Beatles. I mean, is the Beatles, and they, I mean, Queen has passed the Beatles, on Spotify and other streaming platforms. So the Beatles are no longer the kings of classic rock. They were for their time, but, going forward, it's not the case. Yesterday, again, that dropped in, I think, 2019, where I think a guy from India, wakes up in a world that have never heard the Beatles, and but he knows the songs, and he plays them. I haven't seen the movie. Probably need to do that so I can do an episode. So I need to put that on my list. I did see Across the Universe, but and so he's the only one in the world that knows the Beatles exist, and he basically covers the Beatles and becomes a huge sensation. And then Blinded by the Light, again, India. A guy from India comes to the U.S. because he's a huge Bruce Springsteen fan. So, that's both of these. That's 2019 as well. So as classic rock is fading, Hollywood is trying to keep the luster and love the Beatles, love Bruce Springsteen, and we'll do actually at some point I'm going to do a sub channel on the Beatles, just the Beatles. So I mean, I'm not knocking the Beatles here, but love them. But it's interesting, all these rebrands. So specifically, let's get into Elvis, race, and Johnny Cash, because now, first of all, I think Elvis was devastated when MLK passed. I think, and RFK. Um, I think he was, he did, I think a Christmas song in the early 70s, A Christmas in the Ghetto. Um, but this was not an integral to Elvis's brand. Whereas Johnny Cash, the whole Man in Black, I mean, remember Johnny Cash did two live albums in the mid to late 60s at Folsom, Prison and San Quentin. And the black, even back then, black folks were overrepresented in the prison population, and the whole Man in Black was about the outcast. I mean, he was more outspoken when it came to the plight of Native Americans, Johnny Cash, I believe. But certainly the Man in Black, encompasses people of color, and and the outsider. So that was part of Johnny's brand, and really was not part of Elvis's brand. So the reason why that's one of the reasons why I did when I did duos, I put Elvis and Johnny together because they came up together. They were friends. I'm reading, about halfway through Johnny's biography, and he has great things to say about Elvis. And then, I talk about, that great album that Johnny Cash and Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis, and I can't remember the two others that were in there, but it was I think it was the $1 Million Quartet or something like that. But I cover that in duos. But again, this political stance and this view and this champion of the outsider, that Johnny Cash, it was built into his brand. That was his brand, and even before he came up with the Man in Black. I mean, in the early '70s, he was playing the prisons, and so we'll see where where this goes. I don't and of course I talk about the story when I'm watching a Johnny Cash but documentary, and I see his first wife. I'm like, Johnny Cash married a black woman? Well, it turns out, uh, his first wife, her um, grandmother was black, and unlike Elvis, there were Southern preachers burning Johnny Cash records because he was, he was married to an N, the N word woman. And, there were, I mean, when I was watching that documentary, there were Southern newspapers, doing the story. Johnny Cash is married to an N, and Johnny was like, we need to burn his records, and he should, Johnny Cash should not be able to play in X town in whatever, Alabama or Mississippi. And, Johnny Cash's response was like, okay, yeah, I don't want to play there. Okay. You know, you know, up yours. So yeah. So, it's interesting that, there's this dialogue going on throughout this movie with, between, the, the brand of Johnny Cash and the brand that they're trying to construct for Elvis in this movie. So yeah, that's my look. I got out of this too. I need to go take a look at that yesterday, and the film on Springsteen, and see what they're doing there. I've seen enough trailers and read reviews on that, but I need to take a deeper dive because usually when Hollywood's taking a dive into a musician, there's a lot of branding going on, and I need to jump and do the Doors movie too because that's controversial among Doors fans. I actually think it's a very excellent branding job. I've seen the movie a couple times, but I need to jump back into that and so I can get the nitty gritty of the details on it. But I think you don't want an accurate, you want to hit the themes of the brand and then highlight that. And I do think the Doors movie does a very good job of that. And my Jim Morrison branding, episode, I I make that same argument there, but I do need to take a deep dive, and probably before I do yesterday and the Springsteen movie, I'm gonna probably dig out my Doors DVD or whatever and take another look at that because the Doors are my guys. I mean, they're like top five, top six all time for me. I mean, we did, you know, love the Beatles and they're top 10, but when it comes to sheer hours of listening, I've listened to the Doors more than the Beatles, and I love Springsteen too. But so that's probably next, and an episode like this will be the Doors. But yeah, interesting stuff going on here. And I suppose I need to go back and do Bohemian Rhapsody because the rebrand for Queen started before then. A lot of it's just the persecution, in the 70s going into the 80s, linked up with AIDS that Freddie Mercury had to deal with. But I mean, the Queen was really the Beatles of the 70s because they were doing, there's a lot of decent experimentation going on in classic rock at the times, but I do think the Queen was probably the best at it, experimentation, and wisely they brought in a lot more R&B and even funk elements, to their music, and I think that's why. I mean, another one bites the dust, and Under Pressure. I think that's why the music uh, wears well here, in 2023. So yeah, thanks for coming through. Kind of a short one, but this is a fun episode, and obviously, as I'm riffing along with this, I have more on this to-do list to Hollywood and movies. Don't know really. Walk the Line is a very different. I mean, it's more his relation, Johnny Cash's relationship with, you know, Roseanne Cash. And so I don't know. There's not a lot of branding going on there, but Johnny had a lot of input on where that movie would go, and he wanted it to focus on his love of his life. So, I don't think I'm going to do Walk the Line. I said this, back in Duels with Elvis and Johnny, that there's plenty of room to do another Johnny Cash film, dealing with his brand. But you don't need to tweak Johnny Cash's brand. It's strong, and Johnny does have the advantage. That's why I put him together in Duels, as Johnny has that great stuff in the '90s. So he had to come back. Elvis had his '68 comeback, but Elvis passed away a lot younger than Johnny Cash. So anyway, interesting stuff going on there, and more of Hollywood, the movies and branding and musicians coming down the road. So thanks for coming through. Got my 5 albums out here on YouTube and all the streaming services, and I got my 2 science fiction fantasy novels on Amazon, and I also have a novella. And music I go by the name Exodus. So look me up, check me out, and I'll see you next episode.